Next is the endocrine system. So it's a system most people aren't really familiar with. It has relatively small organs throughout the body that secrete hormones. So hormones are chemical messengers that will be delivered by the cardiovascular system throughout the entire body. And there are certain cells and tissues and organs that have receptors for those hormones, and then those hormones cause a response within those tissues and organs. So it's a controlling system in the body, kind of like the nervous system controls lots of aspects of the body. But the endocrine system, through the hormones, control things like our reproductive system, our growth when we're younger. So if you've heard of growth hormone, that you produce more growth hormone when you were a child and were growing than you do now as an adult. So this is the endocrine system that regulates bodily functions. And then these are the organs of the endocrine system. And some organs have multiple functions. So the testes is both, and the ovaries are both part of the endocrine system, but also the reproductive system. Just like the pancreas is part of the endocrine system, but also the digestive system. And then the reproductive system, the associated gonads or testes and ovaries in the sexes that are producing gametes or sex cells, eggs and sperm. And the purpose of the reproductive system is sexual reproduction to produce offspring to keep the species alive and going. And then the integumentary system. Some people don't think of your outer skin as a system, but it actually is. So the integumentary system is your outer skin, and it protects your body from the environment. It's relatively dry, so it prevents water loss, and hopefully you take care of your skin like this person does, so that your skin will protect you throughout your life. Lymphatic and the immune systems. Sorry, where's my cursor? Here we go. So the lymphatic and immune system is our main defense against disease. So part of the immune system cells are transported throughout the entire body by the bloodstream, cardiovascular system. Those are your immune system white blood cells. And the lymphatic system also has organs associated with it, like the tonsils in your mouth, the thymus and the spleen, the appendix, and then many lymph nodes throughout the entire body. And then there's vessels called lymphatic vessels that are draining fluid from your tissues back into the cardiovascular system. And that's because at your tissues, the blood vessels, the capillaries, if you remember, they're leaky. So they're leaking liquid out. That's the plasma. Once it leaks out into your tissues, it's referred to as lymph. That's in the lymphatic vessels, and it's transported back and returned into the blood supply near the heart. So this is the lymphatic and the immune system. And then the nervous system, pretty straightforward, I think. Brain, spinal cord, and all of the nerves that innervate the body. And they are processing information, like if you're reading a book or a map here, I guess, right? You process that visual information in your brain, and then your brain controls the responses, like moving the eyes to read or flipping the page, or you deciding, okay, I need to get up right now and hike over that next hill. So let's move on to the concept of exchange with the environment, the external environment. And we exchange many things like gases, water, nutrients. So every organism is an open system in the sense that organisms are continuously exchanging chemicals, nutrients, materials, and energy with the surroundings. So because of that, organisms have various systems and organs. Organisms have various organs and systems that allow for efficient and controlled exchange. So an animal's size and shape affects its exchanges with the surrounding environment. So for example, here's a streamlined fish that allows it to move easily through the water. But in terms of exchange of gases, a fish will have its mouth open so that water will run through its mouth and over its gills so that the gills are a modified structure to allow exchange of oxygen from the water in through the gills into the blood supply of the fish. And then carbon dioxide moves in the opposite direction, released with the water. If you've ever seen fresh fish, the gills are nice and red because they have many, many small capillary blood vessels to allow for efficient exchange of, in this case, respiratory gases with the water. So every cell in an animal's body is surrounded by a liquidy, watery solution called the interstitial fluid, and allows substances to cross into the cells across membranes. So for example, when you breathe in oxygen, it gets into your blood supply because the oxygen will enter into the capillaries in the blood supply, and then the blood with oxygen is transported throughout the body and the tissues by the cardiovascular system. And then once you're at the bodily cells and tissues, the oxygen diffuses out of the blood capillaries and diffuses into the liquid, interstitial fluid. And it here is exaggerated in terms of how much there is, but there is some of this interstitial fluid surrounding your cells. And then the oxygen diffuses into the cells. Your cells are alive, they do cellular respiration, producing a waste gas, carbon dioxide, and that travels and diffuses in the opposite direction from the cells, interstitial fluid, into the blood capillaries, cardiovascular system. Then that carbon dioxide rich blood eventually works its way to the lungs, where you have the carbon dioxide now leaving the capillaries in the lungs, going into the small little alveolar air spaces, little air sacs in the lungs. And then when you breathe out, you exhale the carbon dioxide into the environment, and then things go in the opposite direction again as you inhale and absorb oxygen into your bloodstream at the lungs, and then back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. So some organisms have relatively simple methods of exchange with the environment, and these are the single-celled organisms like amoeba, which is a protist. Remember, many protists are single-celled, and or things like bacteria. So the materials just simply diffuse across the membrane, or get across the membrane by other methods, but exchange of materials with the environment is pretty straightforward, just crosses the cell membrane, because there's only one cell. That's as simple as you can get. Something like a hydra, which is related to like jellyfish and sea anemones. It's a small freshwater cnidarian, and its cell body, its whole body, is really only a couple of cell layers thick. So because of that, all of the cells are exposed to either the external liquid environment or the liquid environment inside its cavity that's called the gastrovascular cavity. And there's a mouth. The hydra, like jellyfish or sea anemones, has stinging tentacles. Cells on the tentacles, they bring the food item into the mouth. Food item goes into the gastrovascular cavity for digestion. So then nutrients would just cross into those layer of cells through exchange of materials. Carbon dioxide diffuses across those cells into the watery environment, either the gastrovascular cavity or the external environment. So still pretty easy exchange with the environment for relatively small organisms. Once we get to a large, more complicated, large multicellular organism like an animal, things get more complex because all of the cells, actually most of the cells, aren't on the surface. Most of the cells are not in direct contact with the environment. So now we have to have mechanisms like organ systems to deliver materials to allow exchange of materials with ultimately the external environment. And I talked about that a minute ago when I was talking about gas exchange in the lungs and then at the tissue level. So each cell's plasma membranes are where exchange occurs. And if the cells aren't close to the body's surface, the epithelium, then you need some sort of transportation mechanism to deliver nutrients close enough to the cells where you can get exchange. And in large organisms like us, that's the cardiovascular system. this is highly simplified diagram of a living organism. But with us, we have the heart and the large blood vessels that branch into smaller blood vessels and ultimately capillaries that essentially reach all of the cells in our body so that we can get exchange of materials. So the circulatory system again transports materials from the environment to our body tissues and organs and cells, and then we'll carry wastes away in the opposite direction. Some of the wastes, like carbon dioxide, are exhaled out into the environment, cardiovascular system, linked to the respiratory system. But say nutrients that are carried to the cells, that's because the capillaries of the cardiovascular system are surrounding the small intestines of the digestive system where nutrient exchange occurs. And then the blood supply, cardiovascular system is delivering those nutrients ultimately to the cells. Okay? Cells live, survive, carbon dioxide, we talked about how that's expelled. But other wastes that are in the bloodstream are filtered out by the kidneys in the urinary system. So then the kidneys via the urinary systems initially filter the blood, produce urine that is stored in the urinary bladder, and then released into the environment as needed. Alright? And then here's a simplified lung that shows the cardiovascular system bringing in air with ample oxygen, and then exhaling out air with rich carbon dioxide, what we see over here. So large multicellular complex organisms have to have fairly elaborate systems to ensure efficient exchange of materials at the cellular and tissue level. So complex animals, for example, have extensive folded and branching internal structures. Think of our lungs to maximize surface area. That's SA for exchange. So you breathe in air, it gets into the lungs. That's the main trachea. Primary bronchi branches into secondary, tertiary bronchi, finally into small, fine little branches. And at the end of all of these, there's millions of little air sacs, alveoli, where gas exchange is occurring. There's so many of them, and they're really small, but that means there's a huge surface area for efficient gas exchange at the lungs. And what you don't see here is all of the small little circular alveoli, which are too small to see here, are surrounded by capillaries of the cardiovascular system, and that's also not seen here. So, for example, again, our lungs are wonderfully designed so that they maximize exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide from the air that you breathe in and out. So the epithelium of the lungs, meaning the epithelial lining of the small little alveolar air sacs, single layer of cells, so easy gas exchange. The surface area is huge, huge surface area. It's approximately equal to the surface area square feet of a tennis court. So now let's move on to regulating the internal environment of some large organisms like animals. So animals adjust to changing environments, for example, temperature. If the temperature outside fluctuates quite a bit during the day, 40 degrees Celsius is like, maybe 15 degrees Fahrenheit. 37 degrees Celsius is about 95 degrees Fahrenheit. So the external temperature during the day can be pretty cold in the evening, pretty warm at midday. So you get extreme fluctuations. Well, you get pretty good fluctuations of environmental temperatures. But for something like a cat, which is a mammal, its internal temperature will only change about a couple of degrees during the day because it has a way of maintaining what's called homeostatic conditions. Homeostatic means essentially non-changing through various mechanisms, as we'll talk about. We'll talk about a few. That's why certain things that are what we call warm-blooded or endothermic, they maintain pretty constant temperature. And in the cold mornings when the air is cold and us warm-blooded organisms, endothermic, breathe out, you can see that kind of steam because our body temperature is warmer, considerably much warmer than the outside external environment.